Friday, 9:32 a.m., I was scheduled to pitch the $88 million strategy at noon. 14 months of preparation, 32 revisions, 6 stakeholder rewrites, and instead of walking into the boardroom, I was walking into HR. Just a quick conversation. Tracy had typed in the message. No subject line, no context, but I already knew. I knew the second her name appeared at that hour. I packed my laptop, my badge, my keys, not because they asked, because I recognized the shape of an ending. Tracy met me at the door with a tight smile and a half-full coffee mug. No seat offered, no eye contact, just a document already laid out on the table. "It's a mutual separation agreement," she said, voice rehearsed. "You'd receive 1 month of severance, COBRA coverage through next quarter, and a non-disparagement clause if signed today." My name was spelled correctly. That was the only part they got right. I asked, "Is there a reason I'm being asked to sign this? 3 hours before presenting the deal I spent over a year building." She hesitated. "Leadership has decided to take a new direction. Maya will be presenting." Maya, the new hire from Victor's inner circle. She didn't know the client. She hadn't run the numbers. She wasn't there the night we stayed until 2:30 a.m. recalibrating the supplier model after the API collapse. But she would be presenting. I didn't argue, I didn't sign, I didn't go back to my desk, didn't log in, didn't say goodbye. I walked straight out, because the version Maya had wasn't complete. Slide 14, the legal risk matrix, was intentionally blank. Not broken, not deleted, just omitted. The master deck I uploaded had a placeholder, a trigger string only I could activate. Without it, the strategy made assumptions no lawyer would approve. That slide had been my line in the sand, and they stepped over it. The pitch wasn't just numbers, it was a repair mission. 14 months ago at 3:12 a.m., the client had sent a corrupted file and one line. This is what we were left with. No one answered, except me. I stayed in the office until 11 a.m. piecing together what was salvageable. Then I spent 2 months rebuilding trust. One call at a time, 1 week at a time. We weren't even supposed to be invited back, but they gave us one more chance. Through me. Victor didn't know that. Maya would never know that. And Tracy? She was just doing her job. But I had done mine, and I had done it better than anyone ever asked me to. So no, I didn't sign. I didn't ask who made the call. I didn't fight for a second chance. I just left. And if you're still here, maybe walking out of a job that once meant something, maybe sitting in your car trying to make sense of silence, leave a trace. Tell me where you're listening from. And if this sounds like something you've lived through, stay with me. The silence doesn't end here. They called it a fresh start, but I had built too much to pretend this was anything new. My name is Sarah Whitmore, and for 12 years, that name sat at the top of every high-risk account we kept. In client decks, it was always lead S. Whitmore. On budget reports, I was the line item they couldn't afford to lose. Until one day, I wasn't even CC'd. The pitch they stripped from me last Friday? It wasn't an idea. It was a recovery strategy, custom-built to win back a client who had blacklisted us for 2 years. Back in 2021, I was the only one who took the fall when our data retention contract lapsed. I stayed until midnight rebuilding access logs, then flew to Boston on 4 hours' notice to deliver a face-to-face apology. I didn't get promoted, but the client stayed. When the pandemic cut their revenue by half, I worked with their CFO to realign benchmarks. No one paid me extra. No one even noticed, but they did. They sent a card. Because you never said not my job. And that's the part Victor never understood. He was brought in by the board last year to modernize operations, which really meant trim the fat. He never said it to my face, but I knew what I was. I wasn't sleek. I didn't play golf. I didn't forward chain emails at 6 a.m. to show hustle. I showed up when things broke. Victor wanted a team that looked like success, not a team that could rebuild it. He moved Maya into my department after 2 weeks, said it was for collaboration alignment. Then stripped my budget access, my vendor logins, my call schedule. 1 week before the pitch, I was asked to observe, not lead. No one said fired, no one said replaced. They just removed the room key, then asked if I still felt aligned with the company vision. Tracy told me the board wanted fresh voices, but none of those voices had ever picked up the phone at 3:12 a.m. when the client said, "We're done." That deal came back because I stayed on the call, because I said, Let me try again. That pitch they hijacked wasn't a presentation. It was a lifeline. And when they cut me out, they didn't just delete a name. They deleted the only reason that client ever came back. So I didn't stop them. I didn't protest. I just stepped aside. Because you can't fake a foundation. You can paint over the walls, switch out the furniture, bring in younger voices and brighter smiles. But if the ground shifts, you'll feel it in the silence. And silence was all I left them. I didn't ask to join the prep meeting. I only showed up because the calendar link was still active, probably by mistake. The conference room had been rearranged since I last sat at the table. Someone had changed the seating pattern to a tighter arc, almost theatrical, like the team needed to appear more aligned than they actually were. The windows had been dimmed, and the overhead lights were turned up too high. Everything felt brighter, but no one looked comfortable. Maya was standing near the head of the table, rehearsing the intro slide again. She was trying too hard to sound natural. Victor stood beside her with his arms crossed, giving notes after every section, his voice flat and too polished, like he had already decided what success looked like. No one else spoke. No one questioned the pacing or structure or whether the client would buy it. They were performing, not reviewing. Slide 5 came up. I had written that one 8 months ago, in the middle of a Friday outage when half the client's archive vanished overnight. It had taken me 2 full days to recover the damage and 3 more to rebuild trust. That line, "You didn't lose momentum, you lost clarity," was something I said in a 2 a.m. email to calm their CEO down. The client had repeated it back to us in the next quarter's review, calling it the moment they stayed. That line stayed in the pitch ever since. Maya said it too quickly. She rushed the pause between the 2 clauses. It didn't land. Victor still nodded, said, "Perfect phrasing," and moved her forward. They didn't know where that line came from. They didn't remember what it cost to earn it. They continued like that through every section. Slide 7, slide 10, each one bearing the rhythm I had built. Tight pacing, tension where it needed to hold, optimism where it needed to breathe. I didn't need to see the file to know what was coming next. The models they used were mine. The retention curves, the failure thresholds, the engagement benchmarks. Each one was built from 6 quarters of client loss, stitched together after months of late calls and missed holidays. I had written every slide from the perspective of someone trying to keep a client from walking out the door. Maya was delivering it like a campaign. Then they reached slide 14. The screen paused. The graph failed to load. Maya tapped the keyboard twice. She tilted her head, gave a tight laugh, and said, "It's just a glitch. I'll fix that later." No one looked concerned. No one checked version history or ran a recompile. Victor waved it off. "We won't need that one if timing gets tight anyway." But I knew the truth. That slide didn't glitch. It failed because I had pulled the macro 2 days ago. It relied on an external input I hosted privately, something I built in 2021 when the Lindstrom forecast collapsed. That data had saved the account once before, and the client trusted it more than anything else in the deck. They wouldn't know why it was missing, not yet, but they would feel it. Victor didn't ask where the error came from. Maya didn't know it was broken. The meeting moved on. The team kept talking about flights and logistics. I stayed in the corner seat. I hadn't spoken, and no one had asked me to. When it ended, I let the room clear. I closed my notebook slowly, even though there was nothing written in it. I glanced at the reflection in the glass wall, the rows of chairs, the flicker of the paused screen, the empty silence where my voice used to belong. They didn't notice I was still there. But tomorrow, when the pitch starts, when the client leans forward and asks why slide 14 doesn't match the last quarter's logic, when the system fails to load what I never gave them permission to keep, that's when they'll notice what else didn't show up. The room was too quiet for a Monday, not the nervous kind, just hollow, as if everyone was performing calm without knowing what it meant. The client team arrived 4 minutes early, led by Deborah Lynn, the one person I used to speak with weekly but hadn't heard from in months. She walked in without smiling, without sitting, just glanced around until Victor gestured toward the open seats. He didn't stand. Maya took the front. She had the deck open before anyone asked, her fingers tight around the remote clicker, her voice rising too early. I had done that once, rushed the first line, forgot to let the room settle. It only worked if you had earned the silence first. She hadn't. No one interrupted, not yet. The first slides passed without friction. They always do. Friction doesn't live in the greeting. It waits behind the numbers. Deborah leaned back when slide 5 came up. I watched her face tilt half an inch, just enough to show she remembered it. That line. My line. You didn't lose momentum. You lost clarity. Maya smiled like she understood it. Victor smiled like he wrote it. Deborah didn't smile back. 10 minutes in, they reached the benchmark segment. The point where the client expected to see proof that the rebuild was stable, that the model could scale with their Q3 expansion. It should have transitioned seamlessly, slide 13 to 14 line by line, but it didn't. The screen froze, then blinked, then dropped to the standard error failback. No numbers, no graph, just the title header. Market alignment, Q2, Q3 conversion ratios. Maya stopped speaking, not abruptly, just long enough that silence filled the cracks she couldn't patch. Deborah looked at her, then at Victor, then back again. It's just buffering, Victor said, reaching for the keyboard. We had it during prep. There's a macro integration that... It's not loading from your end, Deborah said flat. No one replied, because there was no macro. Not anymore. They moved forward without it, skipped the most critical proof point in the entire proposal. Maya fumbled the transition. Victor talked over her. Someone coughed. One of the junior partners on the client side whispered something into their phone, then passed it to Deborah without looking up. And still no one said my name. I wasn't in the room. I wasn't on the credits. But every beat they missed, every number they failed to explain, every pivot they couldn't justify, it came from something I had held in place for 3 years without asking for recognition. They finished in silence, not a heavy silence, just void. No one clapped, no one leaned in for follow-ups. The client asked one question about implementation strategy, then stood to leave. Thank you, Deborah said. Not to Victor, not to Maya, just, to the room. They packed up quickly. I imagine the moment they left, Victor turned to Maya with some clipped excuse, something about tech not syncing, someone forgetting a file. But that file was never theirs to forget. It was never in their hands to begin with. And what they didn't know, what they hadn't even asked, was that slide 14 wasn't just a visual. It was a condition. The macro didn't just display the benchmark. It triggered a time-based key sequence tied to our renewal clause. No slide 14, no data trigger, no formal bid, no legal obligation to stay. Which meant by the time Victor stepped out into the hallway and opened his inbox, the client had already walked. I didn't go in the next day. No one asked me to. No one asked me anything. At 8:42 a.m., Tracy forwarded an email thread with no subject line and no commentary. The only message was from Deborah Lynn, time-stamped 6:04 a.m., addressed to Victor and legal, CC'd to Maya and 3 partners. We'll be pausing progress on the Q3 extension pending internal review. No mention of cancellation, no mention of fault, just one word, pausing. But I knew what it meant. No client says pause unless they've already decided not to restart. I stared at the screen, then closed the laptop. Not in anger, not in triumph, just still, like I was waiting for something I didn't need to hear. The silence wasn't satisfying. It wasn't vindicating. It was familiar. Tracy called an hour later. She never called. I let it ring 4 times before answering. They think it's a misunderstanding, she said. They're trying to reschedule a side meeting. Maya's preparing a clarifying note. Victor wants her to loop in pre-sales to redo the benchmarks. I didn't say anything. You knew they'd walk, didn't you? She added. I didn't answer that either. The thing about systems held together by presence is, once that presence is gone, no one notices until something slips. And when something does slip, no one blames the absence. They blame the pressure, the formatting, the intern who ran the wrong version. By noon, the office had entered what they called containment mode. Every email was reviewed by legal. All external comms were filtered through 2 VPs and a PR liaison who had never spoken to a client directly. And still, not one person mentioned my name. The hallway chatter shifted from "we almost had it" to "it wasn't a real loss." Someone said Deborah was overreacting. Someone else said she was just using the failed macro as an excuse. But no one asked why the macro existed in the first place. No one asked who had built it, who maintained it, who deactivated it. The benchmark segment was never just numbers. It was compliance-integrated logic. It carried the timestamp signal to our data partner's backend, the same backend that flagged an offer as binding. No macro meant no timestamp. No timestamp meant no legal trail. No trail meant no bid. Victor held a floor meeting at 3:15 p.m. He stood in front of the glass board, dry erase marker in hand, sketching contingency maps. Nobody said it outright, but the energy had shifted. The chairs were pulled back slightly. The note-taking was thinner. People were nodding with the kind of cautious compliance you only see when layoffs are in the air. And Maya, she wasn't smiling anymore. She didn't look panicked. She looked tired, not from working, from not knowing what she'd stepped into. Because it's one thing to inherit a strategy. It's another thing to realize it was never yours to carry. And somewhere, deep down, she knew she wasn't just missing a slide. She was missing a foundation. The one I never offered to transfer because no one thought to ask if I would. By Wednesday, the calls stopped being scheduled. Not canceled, just unconfirmed. Calendars that used to be booked 2 weeks out now held blank mornings. No one said it, but everyone felt it. The client had gone quiet, and not the kind that returns after a nudge. This was the kind that settles in, the kind that grows roots. I walked past the east hallway once, out of habit. That side of the building always smelled like printer toner and old coffee, where we used to prep war rooms before every major pitch. The whiteboard still had pieces of last month's go-live checklist. Someone had erased half the lines, but the ink had sunk into the board years ago. Slides 12-14, lock benchmarks, sync macro test W/Sarah. That line stayed. No one noticed it was still there. Maya walked in around 9:20. I could see her through the glass walls. Her gait was slower. She no longer carried the badge with the branded lanyard, just clipped it to her bag like a temp. She didn't sit at her usual desk. She moved to the far corner under the vent, as if trying to shrink the space she occupied. Victor didn't show up until almost 11. He looked like he hadn't slept. There was a printout of the pitch deck folded under his arm. From where I stood, I could see handwritten notes bleeding through the paper. Red ink, circles, question marks, a corner torn. They pulled in the strategy lead for a closed session around noon. 5 people, no agenda sent, no summary shared. Just a door closed for 90 minutes and no laughter when it opened. One of the analysts left the room first. Her eyes were red. She didn't go back to her desk. She left the building. By Thursday, legal started making calls. Someone from compliance emailed me with a question about the original benchmark documentation. I let it sit. 10 minutes later, a second email came, this time marked urgent. I replied with a single sentence. That version is no longer active. No explanation, no apology, and still, no one asked why. They had started to realize the system didn't break because of one missing file. It never broke. It just didn't recognize the people trying to use it. That macro wasn't stored in a folder. It was a handshake between me and the data partner I brought in 3 years ago under a soft integration clause only I negotiated. They never asked what would happen if I left, because they never imagined I would. Maya sent me a Slack message that afternoon. She didn't say hi. She didn't use emojis. Did I do something wrong? I stared at it for 3 minutes. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She was asking for orientation, for bearings, for a hint that she was swimming in something bigger than a glitch. I didn't answer, because the truth wasn't hers to carry. The system didn't reject her. It just didn't recognize her. Because systems don't need passwords to break. Sometimes they just wait. And when the wrong person logs in, they don't crash. They stay still until someone finally realizes nothing is moving. The alert hit at 8:03 a.m. It didn't scream, didn't flash red. It was just a soft ping on the operations dashboard. External sync delay exceeded threshold, 14 minutes. 14 minutes wasn't enough to raise flags, but it was enough to start a timer, and timers were everything. The system had been calibrated on precision. Not speed, not volume, precision. That was always the sell. It catches problems before they know they're problems. I used to say that on client calls, back when people still asked me to speak. Now the delay was growing, 17 minutes, then 21. The client hadn't responded to Maya's follow-up. Not to the Slack message, not to the second email marked high importance. No bounce back, just silence. Victor called IT into the war room. Run a trace, he said. Check partner side latency. But the latency wasn't on their side. The connection was technically live, that was the trick. It always stayed live until it didn't recognize the handshake. They ran a full credential sweep. Maya volunteered to reset the access token. One of the engineers hesitated. Should we clear the encryption log first? Victor snapped. Just reset it. So they did, and that's when the dashboard crashed. Not all at once, just column by column. One dataset timed out. Then the logs grayed, then the client instance flagged an unauthorized attempt and locked the user. It took them 2 hours to realize that every login attempt since Tuesday had been shadow tagged under a temporary profile. None of them had full access. They had been working inside a mirror, not a copy, not a backup, a shell. Because the original environment, the real one, was gated behind a legal retention clause that only triggered with my active credential, and I hadn't logged in since last Friday. By 1:12 p.m., the internal thread was up to 87 messages. Legal pinged procurement. Procurement pinged compliance. Compliance reached out to the data partner. No one could answer the same question. Who owns the integration key? At 2:06, Victor walked past my old desk. He didn't say anything. Just stood there for a moment like something was supposed to happen. Like he expected the chair to spin, or the screen to light up, or some hidden file to unspool itself. But it didn't. Because I wasn't in the system. Not anymore. The contract I signed 3 years ago wasn't about software, it was about presence. I wasn't just the architect. I was the authenticator, the quiet line of trust that no one ever saw but everything depended on. They thought they had replaced me, but they hadn't removed me. They had just muted me and hoped the echo would carry. But now the echo had faded, and all that was left was the sound of a system looking for someone who was no longer looking back. Friday morning began with a quiet tension. One that didn't hum with panic, just waited. No one said anything. No one dared leave their desk. Even Maya, who usually arrived late, had been sitting at her station since 7:40, eyes fixed on a screen that hadn't changed in hours. At 9:41, the call came in. Not through ops, not through legal, direct, line 1. From Deborah Lynn. Tracy answered first, but she didn't even try to hold the line. She transferred it up immediately. Victor took the call on speaker, though no one else was in the room. Maybe he thought distance would steady his voice. "Hi, Deborah," he said, forced calm. "I'm glad you reached out. We were just about to—" She didn't wait for the sentence to end. "Where's Sarah?" He blinked, then sat down. "She's no longer on the project," he replied too fast, as if the speed could make it true. Deborah let the silence linger. That wasn't the question. Outside the glass wall, people had stopped typing, not intentionally, just stilled. There's a weight certain voices carry. Deborah's was one of them. She never raised her volume. She didn't need to. "I asked you last year if her systems had been fully transitioned. You said yes." Victor's eyes narrowed, not at her, at the space between her words, the space where answers used to live. "You said she reviewed the backup scripts," she continued, her tone even, "that the signature keys were embedded." He exhaled through his nose, then looked down as if the floor would give him better answers than his own team. "I need to know," she said, "who owns the retention logic." He didn't speak, not because he was hiding something, because he didn't know what had already slipped through. "She wrote it," Deborah said finally. "Didn't she?" There was no need for confirmation. The line went quiet, long enough to make you wonder if the call had dropped. "She's no longer with the team," he repeated, voice low now, almost rehearsed. "I know," Deborah replied. "That's why I'm calling." The rest came without emotion, just facts. No sync logs had registered in 4 days. The macro key had returned a null signature twice. All post-pitch support requests had been routed to an auto-reply. The platform had failed to authenticate its own anchor. She wasn't angry. She wasn't looking for blame. "I didn't ask you to win the pitch," Deborah said. "I asked if Sarah would be there when the system needed her." She didn't wait for an answer. She ended the call. No goodbye, no closing remarks, just the hollow sound of a line gone dead. Victor didn't move, not for a full minute. His hands stayed folded, elbows locked, staring into a screen that was still open to slide 14, the same one that never loaded. And outside that glass door, no one whispered her name, but they didn't need to. Because now, the one voice that mattered had already spoken it. The building I worked from now didn't have a name on the door. That was intentional. It sat between a reclaimed factory wall and a florist that opened at odd hours. The front desk was always empty. We didn't have reception. If you knew how to find us, you were already part of it. We called it a studio, not an agency, not a firm, just a space where things that broke could be rebuilt the right way. It started with one client, the one they thought they had secured with a slide deck and a borrowed smile. 3 days after their silence, I received a direct message. No logo, no subject line, just, "We'd like to know how you would have finished slide 14. I didn't reply immediately. I waited, not as a tactic, just as a choice, because the woman I used to be would have answered at midnight. She would have over-prepared, over-explained, apologized for delays she didn't cause. But that woman wasn't here anymore. The one who stayed on that 2 a.m. call in Boston, who rebuilt recovery tables with no budget, who sat outside Victor's office for a meeting that never came. She had nothing left to prove, so I answered on a Monday. With a single line, I'd start with the truth they never let you see. The first virtual session wasn't formal. No pitch, no pitch deck. Just me, a single shared screen, and a live walkthrough of what the macro was actually designed to do. Not just forecast risk, but calibrate trust across 12 data nodes, accounting for behavioral variance that no one on their team had even noticed. I didn't say that to impress. I said it because that's what they paid for. What they always paid for. Clarity. 2 weeks later, they moved everything over. Quietly, no press release, no announcement. But the news spread, not to shareholders, not to headlines, to people. One by one, messages began arriving, not from recruiters, from account leads, from vendor heads, from 3 different analysts who had once sat next to me in those late-night war rooms and watched what happened when I solved something no one else could explain. They didn't say, "Can we hire you?" They asked, "Can we build with you?" And I said yes. Not because I needed to win, but because I needed to finish something without interruption. The system we built didn't look sleek. It didn't sell buzzwords. It didn't promise velocity. It promised alignment. And it delivered, because every part of it, from the sequence triggers to the handoff protocol, was designed for one thing: to keep people from being erased. No names cut from CC lines, no midnight red lines, no disappearing logins, just the work, and the people who made it possible. That was my name now. Not a title, not a badge, just a presence that couldn't be reassigned. I never corrected them. When the articles came out 6 months later, break-in client continuity at Marlar Finch, Q3 drop-off unexplained, system failure or strategic overhaul, my name was never mentioned. Victor's was. So was Maya's and Tracy's. I read them once, then closed the browser. Not out of resentment, just clarity. The story wasn't mine anymore, because while they were busy redrafting timelines, trying to reframe what pause meant, I was watching something quieter take shape. Clients didn't post testimonials. They didn't make noise. They just moved, from one team to another, from borrowed trust to built trust. The first time I realized the shift was real was in a client feedback form, a field meant for additional notes. Someone had typed, "It worked because she was still here." No name, just that, and I knew what it meant. Not everything has to be reclaimed to be remembered. They never called to apologize, never admitted they had cut me loose, never said my removal was a mistake. They didn't need to. Because I had learned something more valuable than retaliation. Systems don't survive on ownership. They survive on alignment. And when alignment breaks, not even the cleanest code or the brightest pitch or the safest politics can hold it together. I don't tell this story to be heard. I tell it so you understand the silence. Because there are days when you'll be erased before anyone knows what you built. Days when your seat is gone and your login doesn't work and no one fights for your name in the call, and it will feel like nothing is left. But there is. The absence they created, that's yours now. Let it echo. Let it shape the next thing you build. Let it remind them you weren't just part of the system. You were the reason it worked. If you've ever watched a room forget your name while repeating your work, if you've ever rebuilt something in silence only to have it handed off with a smile that wasn't yours, then you already know this story. Like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear they weren't replaceable, just temporarily misplaced. And if you want more stories where quiet wins, hit subscribe.